Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, my name is Gia Adhra Yazid and I'm from class 3C. Today I want to tell you about what I got from the paper that I have already read. So this paper is talking about study abroad's contribution to critical thinking and world citizenship. It's also talking about the difference between critical thinking and creative thinking. This paper is articulates and defends two theses to Richard Paul and Linda Elder. First, about creative thought and critical thought cannot be separated. Second, the intellectual traits constitutive of critical thinking are interdependent. This is combined with certain impact studies show that study abroad enhances both creativity and criticality. Since study abroad can lead to intellectual growth in participants, this paper recommends certain policies and practices to help ensure the desired gain. So, first, this paper is talking about the benefit of study abroad. Study abroad is typically described as life-changing, a defining moment, or so participants say. Study abroad helps shape a participant's life for years after the experience. In IEA's study abroad programs between 1950 and 1999 show that study abroad positively influenced the maturity, education, and career paths of participants. The second one is talking about beyond the cultural and linguistic benefits. Consider the improvement of creative thinking and communication skills. Tracy Ranstorm-Williams shows that students who study abroad generally demonstrate a greater interest in intercultural communication skills after their time abroad than students who stay on campus. Living abroad has been found to boost creativity. Galinsky discovered a robust correlation between living overseas and enhanced creativity, identifying adaptation as the critical mechanism that underlies this linkage. Adaptation may be the key psychological element that explains why living abroad is associated with creativity. Because culture is such a pervasive force, impacting and shaping every aspect of one's life, adapting oneself to a new culture, learning how to behave and think in a different way. The next is talking about the inseparability of creative and critically. Study abroad promotes the development of not only creative thinking but also critical thinking for two reasons. First, according to the commonly accepted model of critical thinking developed by Richard Paul and Linda Elder, creative thinking and critical thinking are so interwoven that neither can be separated from the other without an essential loss to both. Second, in line with the Paul Elder model, certain traits of mind, the growth of several of which study abroad has been shown to advance, constitute critical thinking, and the traits are interdependent such that the acquisition, possession, retention of employment, development and enrichment of one requires the same of the others, and our critical thinking will be compromised if we are severely lacking in any of these traits. Creative thinking involves a process of making or constructing, whereas critical thinking involves a process of judging or assessing. Whereas creative thinking is divergent and critical thinking is convergent, whereas creative thinking tries to create something new and critical thinking seeks to assess worth or validity in something that exists, whereas creative thinking is carried on by violating accepted principles and critical thinking is carried on by applying accepted principles. Although creative and critical thinking may very well be different sides of the same coin, they are not identical. The next is about the interdependence of intellectual traits. To establish the interdependence thesis, consider intellectual humility. Intellectual humility consists in the Socratic knowledge of one's own ignorance. To realize that we know and what we do not know, we need both intellectual integrity and intellectual courage. Intellectual integrity enables us to be true to our own thinking and to recognize the limits of our knowledge as well as the limitation of our point of view, whereas intellectual courage enables us to squarely face our own biases, prejudice, and whatever else is responsible for our own cognitive shortcomings. Different forms of thinking for oneself in accordance with standards of rationality and such thinking for oneself constitutes intellectual autonomy. Both also require intellectual perseverance because, given the demands of thinking for oneself and taking responsibility for one's own thinking, one constantly needs to stick to the true and the relevant and use one's knowledge and insight to the optimum level despite obstacles and difficulties, especially when the struggle with uncertainty and confusion may persist for an extended period. Intellectual courage requires intellectual empathy. To discover our own biases and prejudice, we often must entertain views that differ from our own and reasons from premises with which we disagree. Likewise, intellectual empathy requires confidence in reason and fair-mindedness in addition to creativity and imagination. Next, this paper is also talking about the cultivation of critical thinking. Study abroad spurs the growth of several intellectual traits. Given the interdependence of intellectual traits, if study abroad furthers the development of intellectual humility, intellectual courage, intellectual empathy, intellectual perseverance, it also furthers the development of intellectual integrity, intellectual autonomy, confidence in reasons, and fair-mindedness. All intellectual traits constitutive of critical thinking are thus enchained, and so is critical thinking itself. Next is the Socratic ideal of rationality. Socrates was a critical thinker par excellence, the Platonic form of critical thinking as it were. As evidenced by Plato's dialogues, he manifested all intellectual traits constitutive of critical thinking. In augmenting critical thinking, therefore, study abroad makes a contribution to the realization of the Socratic ideal of rationality. Such a contribution consists in helping cultivate fair-minded, creative, and critical individuals and societies. And next is about the Diognean ideal of cosmopolitanism. In addition to critical individuals and societies, study abroad helps cultivate citizens of the world and the single community to which they belong. Just as certain traits and habits characterize the critical way of life, so certain virtues and commitments exemplify the cosmopolitan mode of being. Just as study abroad develops the critical traits and habits, so it fosters the cosmopolitan virtues and commitments. And the last is this paper concludes with 3 schematic proposals for ensuring intellectual growth in study abroad students. First, study abroad, while not inexpensive, foster the development of informed, critical, and creative thinkers who communicate effectively, to borrow a signature phrase from my university's quality engagement plan. Second is considering adaptation is the critical mechanism that underlies the robust correlation between living overseas and enhanced creativity. Study abroad programs ought to be structured in such a way as to increase participants' chance of adapting to the host country's culture. After reading this paper, I found the benefit and weaknesses. The benefit of this paper is we can find out about the advantage of studying abroad, and we can find out how studying abroad can enhance both creative and critical thinking. With study abroad, we can also find out and adapt to other cultures. And the weaknesses that I found from this paper is this paper more focused on critical thinking but does not really focus it about the citizenship as in the title. So after reading this paper, I feel like I want to have a dream to study abroad. Saying these many benefits and good opportunities that we can take while study abroad makes me feel interested. Maybe I can start by preparing what I need to continue my education in overseas, and such as improving language fluency and practicing my critical thinking by reading a lot and preparing other things. So I think that's all from me. Thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.